So welcome. This is the next in our series of interviews with University of Buckingham Center for Heterodox Social Science Fellows. Today we have Neema Parvini, who is a writer, was an academic, has a channel called Academic Agent, which you should check out. And we're just going to have a general conversation about his career, his book, and some of the things he's working on. Neema, welcome.
Thanks.
So yeah, I really want to just begin, where it all began really, and how you got where you are. Tell us about, early academic career. You were studying Shakespeare, so something really quite far from the social sciences.
Well, funny enough, it all started when I was an undergraduate, and I was studying English literature. But I found that increasingly what I was studying was not English literature, but various forms of Marxist theory. And I was quite into the Marxist theory because I'm interested in politics and how the world works. And I noticed that a lot of the material on Shakespeare was dominated by a certain approach, which was called New Historicism, cultural materialism, which was all predicated on the idea that individuals are entirely the product of their time and their place. And so, the way to understand Shakespeare really is to try to develop like a complete understanding of how the early modern culture worked, et cetera, et cetera. And, some of that, a lot of that stuff makes sense, but some of it, was dominated by a kind of anti-human mindset. So a lot of my early work and my PhD thesis, I felt like I wanted to take on that idea of, the idea of Shakespeare as an individual genius, for example, was very discredited within the academy. Rather he is a kind of confluation of structural forces or something. Right. And his, all of his plays are about either subversion or containment. Okay. So I wanted to take on some of these, Michel Foucault and Louis Althusser and these sorts of thinkers. The way ideas move in in the discipline of English is that they're more or less taken kind of lying down. They just become orthodoxies to be reproduced. Whereas I was kind of taught to think, well, hold on a second. The first thing is, are these ideas true? Are they describing reality? A lot of my early work on Shakespeare was rethinking some of those ideas. I'm not going to say they're all complete nonsense. There's obviously something there. They are describing something, but maybe they don't get the full picture of, the human condition or something as I think Shakespeare understood. So that's how I started. Okay. I wrote five books on Shakespeare.
I noticed that. That's quite something. So
I was a prolific academic early on. And one of the things that was kind of really changed the way I think about everything, in some ways it kind of ruined the world for me, but in other way it was reading a book by Jonathan Haidt called The Righteous Mind. And there was another book called Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. And the key insight there was that most of the time we feel, we have intuitions and gut instincts first, and reasoning follows on. So we like to think of ourselves as rational, but most of the time we're just going on intuition and then coming up with the BS after the fact. Once you kind of see this aspect of people, it's kind of disillusioning. Because, you kind of, it's not the way we like to think of ourselves. We have a bias towards rationality, but this is just a kind of self-image. What's really happening is that you have a feeling and then you try to, well, why do I actually think that? And you come up with all the stuff afterwards. So then I thought, well, if this stuff is really true, maybe I could apply that to Shakespeare. So 2 of my books are about an attempt to see, well, how much of this stuff can we see, embodied in Shakespeare? Jonathan Haidt wrote about morality in a very interesting way. He's got this idea of moral foundations theory.
Right.
And,
Taste buds.
Yeah, the 6 pillars and so on.
Right.
And I thought, well, maybe, again, if Shakespeare is this universal writer who can speak, to all people of all ages, as Ben Jonson said, maybe I'll be able to see this in Shakespeare, what was his morality and so on. So I've got a book called Shakespeare's Moral Compass that does that as well. So in a nutshell, that's a lot of my stuff on Shakespeare was challenging Marxist orthodoxies and trying to do exciting new things within the discipline of English.
But how much, first of all, how much postmodernism and how much of the, what we'd call critical social justice around race, gender, sexuality, how strong was that at the time, or was it still a little bit more of that older historical materialism, Marxist tradition?
I mean, it was definitely creeping in, I would say.
Okay.
It's a little bit, from my perspective, a lot of that stuff seemed to be coming from America. I remember I went to a few conferences in the mid-2010s and encountering someone who genuinely was like, well, Shakespeare was a black woman.
Right.
I know this has become like a joke.
Right.
This was like some postgraduate, and I just didn't know what to say. I just, I remember being another one and hearing somebody say, well, do you know what? You are the problem. Do you remember all those, remember all that sort of stuff? So, yeah, I mean, it was definitely going on, but it hadn't yet reached the point where it was intolerable, which I think really came in the Summer of Love, where it started to become like, you were getting diktats that you had to support certain things. And that was really where, I already started to think about topics other than Shakespeare because I got into economics. I have a book on economic history and I guess classical liberal theory called The Defenders of Liberty.
Tell us about that, because
before I became before I was in academia, I also worked in the city for a period with, we were doing conferences for investment banks and things like that, just a completely different world. And so I got to meet like all of these kind of guys in market data and things like that. And part of the job I had was explaining what I had to write the programs. So I had to actually understand what they were doing. So I kind of had to map out how the city worked and, with the buy side and the sell side and all this sort of stuff. And I found it quite interesting. And I think I kind of picked up an interest in how economics works, how money works and all of that from then. And I just kind of developed it. And that is in fact how I started my, what I did at the start of my YouTube channel was just trying to teach economics and, just.
And it's gone very well. I mean, obviously there was an appetite for it because you kind of set off on your own. Mm-hmm. When did you leave academia again?
2020.
2020. So you left what is the world we both know intimately, a world where you have kind of like a very secure job. You're just trying to get your publications, to get the promotions. There's not a lot of risk involved. And then you're suddenly off on your own. And what was that like?
Well, the biggest, this is kind of like the biggest thing that I realized, talking about money and economics, was realizing that my old wage was actually a cap. There's actually, like, when you're working for yourself, there's actually no limit to the amount of money you can make. That's something that, anybody who's interested in entrepreneurship can think about as a kind of mindset thing. But yeah, to be honest, I found it liberating because you didn't have to kind of care about, what this person might say or that person might say and the endless meetings and so on. I mean, I was always into ideas. Right. Wasn't in it for the, the committee meetings and the, and all the rest of it. I was interested in ideas. And I guess one of the disappointments in my life really is discovering how many people who are in academia are just not into ideas.
It is. I noticed that even during my PhD, where a lot of them were into the process of what do I need to do to get ahead. And the PhD was almost a bit of a chore. It's you didn't get the sense necessarily that subject matter and interest was driving people, many people, and they were finding it really hard, so and I can understand it. It's quite an isolating experience, but I agree with you. A lot of people, it's just they did well in school and they went from the undergraduate to the master's to the PhD. The next thing would be getting the academic job, and it was part of this education process and not necessarily driven by a passion for a particular subject. So you realized that you left the asylum, you left, and then I guess the economics book. This emerges after you leave academia.
Well, I think I was still there. When I did that one.
Okay.
Somehow, it's weird. Like in English department, bringing an economics book, but again, I will kind of. Why should you, like, when you read thinkers in the past, they weren't bound by what department we were in. They kind of followed ideas, right? So that was something. But then another book that was very influential on my thinking, and kind of still jolted me out of a lot of my priors, liberal priors, you might say, was James Burnham's The Machiavellians. Also the Managerial Revolution, but it was the Machiavellians that really hit me. I think I read it back in 2017, 2018, and I was writing this book on liberal economics and trying to, in some ways, defend the liberal order from attacks from the left and right at that point. And this, once you really get your head around what James Burnham is talking about, you realize that even a lot of the stuff you learn in economics ends up being a justification for some other power structure, and a lot of the way that you think the world works is not how you imagine it. He talks about organized minorities, elites, democracy essentially being a sham, and many other things. So if you're unprepared for all of those things, that book is a jolt. And I found, at the time, I found it really depressing. But it was it takes quite a long time. And like I was talking about with Haidt and Kahneman, one of the things you learn there is that people don't like their core assumptions being challenged. And so you end up having cognitive dissonance, you lashing out, getting angry, or finding ways to confirm your existing biases. Okay.
Yeah.
But with the elite theory, essentially, I couldn't do that because, every time I found myself trying to come up with counters and so on, I realized I was just coping in a sense. I was doing the confirmation bias thing. That really drove the next book I wrote, which was called The Populist Delusion.
Which was I was then going to get onto is tell us about the core thesis, the core argument.
And this is another thing about academia versus that book. Populist Delusion has sold more than all my other books, which is kind of, you spend years writing these tomes on Shakespeare and so on, and got me a cup of coffee. But Populist Delusion did sell a lot of copies. So Populist Delusion really is a survey of the classical elite theorists and a few other thinkers that advance this idea that everywhere and always it is the organized minority who rule over the disorganized mass. And a lot of the fictions that we have been sold, that change comes about through, I think that there's a kind of dare I say, boomer view of the world that in order to get change, all you need is a lovely kind of massive civil rights protest, Bob Dylan outside Washington, or Martin Luther King speeches or Gandhi, and it's all like kind of, this is the way real change comes about. It's just people marching with placards, and eventually the powers that be are so overwhelmed by the force of the public sentiment that but that is not really how change comes about in our society, or indeed in any society. And even if you look at those movements I talked about, they end up in the final analysis being the work of organized minorities who had agendas and plans and basically just made things happen. I'm not necessarily saying this is good or bad. I'm just saying this is how things are. So, yeah.
But and do you, just in terms of, so there's kind of two parts to that. One is the elite theory, which of course goes back to Machiavelli, and that's a long-running theme. And then we have the bureaucratization or the managerial part of the picture, the Burnham. Do you see those two? How do you see those two fitting together? Because clearly one has a much older problem. Although I guess you could talk about bureaucracies going back to ancient Egypt.
So the elite theorists, I mean, just to be clear, the elite theorists are Mosca, Giordano Mosca, Vilfredo Pareto, who's more famous as an economist, and for the 80-20 rule.
Right,
like this,
the Pareto principle.
Yeah,
Pareto optimal.
He also wrote this massive book called The Minds and Society. It's 4 volumes long. And a guy called Robert Michels. They were all Italian, although I think Robert Michels was half German and Pareto was half Swiss. But they're typically called the Italian elite school.
Oh, okay. I didn't know that about Michels. The Iron Law of Oligarchy.
Yeah, the Iron Law of Oligarchy. And funny enough, Mosca and Pareto weren't friendly. They didn't like each other because Mosca basically, I mean, typical academic stuff. He's copying me. That's my idea. Give me credit and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
So, and Michels was kind of a little bit younger, so he's caught between the two of them. But we need not get into all of that stuff. The basic idea of those three is the same. And I call it Mosca's law. Everywhere and always, the organized minority rules over the disorganized mass, and power always works in that way. Now, superficially, most people say, well, that's obvious. Yeah, obviously that's the case. But in my experience, if you actually apply it systematically, people then come up against some of these moments where they don't actually believe it. Superficially speaking, people are like happy to say, oh, well, Labour and Tory, they're really they're two
sides of the same coin. There's
two sides of the same coin. That's the phrase.
Circulation of elites, Labour, Tory,
people are happy, but when you actually drill down to it, how much they really believe that, so there's a difference between kind of accepting it superficially and really, and the elite theorists were quite certain that this is the way things work. What Michels did is he took the basic ideas of Pareto and Mosca, and he said, look, it's so you have an elite who are often entrenched, i.e. they've been there for a very long time. And Pareto said, well, you can get elite circulation, a cycling out of one class of elites and a cycling in of another type, okay? At the moment, in Britain, in America, in Europe, lots of people have had enough of the ruling class, okay? A lot of people feel like we need a new set of people in, okay? But actually making that happen is much more difficult because they are entrenched. And Robert Michels was very interested in why was it so hard. And so the Iron Law of Oligarchy it goes into the reasons why it's so difficult to dislodge an entrenched ruling class. And they've got all sorts of advantages, resource advantages, communications advantages, technical expertise. But another big advantage they've got is that they can set up the rules in such a way that by the time somebody actually gets accepted into the system to rule, their kind of rough edges have been shaved off. Right. I mean, I know there's at the moment, as we're recording this, a large attempt, for example, to attack Nigel Farage because he said some stuff in school and all this was typical politics stuff. From a lot of people's point of view, Reform UK, as they're preparing possibly to be the government, are already in the process of succumbing to this Iron Law of Oligarchy.
Right.
People want Reform to be this kind of new transformational force. But by the, Nigel Farage has been a figure, for 30 years at this point. And you could say, well, a lot of, he's had to moderate, he's had to change. You can see a similar thing with Le Pen in France. If you have a look at, say, Le Pen versus her father, or I would argue you can see a similar thing with Trump in America. So.
But is there I'm trying to think of the counters. Somebody could say, how is this argument disprovable, right? What would constitute evidence for you that someone new had come in, like they refused to wear a tie, or because you could say that. Yeah. Just to stick with Trump, for example, you could certainly say that he has rankled a lot of people and continues to do so. Mm-hmm. It depends, I guess, how we defining elites. Like if you say everyone's wearing a tie, then yeah, okay, that's a circulation. If you say, what we know is that higher education, people with higher education increase, particularly elite higher education, are quite dominant. So from a kind of class background, yeah, that seems evident. But perhaps maybe from an ideological standpoint, yes, there's maybe some taming in bourgeoisement, but equally, you could argue that the establishment really doesn't want populists, even of the ones we've had, even the Le Pens, and look at the way they're flipping out over Farage and Trump. So is that not genuinely something that is violating the old rules? I don't know.
I think there's a question of degree. So when a lot of these guys are talking about circulation, elite circulation, we're talking about the change from the aristocracy in France to the French Revolution, or the change from the Tsarist Russia to Bolshevik Russia, something on that sort of level, or Weimar Republic to Hitler, something like that, which is very recognized, or Shah of Iran to the Islamic Republic. So you can see that is one set of characters has been swept aside, and there's a new cast of characters that have come in who are of a different stripe, a different type.
Right. Okay.
Okay. Whereas with Trump, you could say, well, okay, yes, but in the background, I can see he's meeting with Larry Ellison, and Larry Ellison's also meeting with Keir Starmer, right? Mark Zuckerberg, he swapped a red hat for a blue hat for a red hat.
Right.
But it's still Mark Zuckerberg. In some cases, it's literally the same individuals. So it is a question of, well, how substantial is the change? And so, you're kind of looking at a structure. So I'm not going to say that the populists coming in are not some sort of change. Obviously, and there is factional disputes even within an elite, but there is a difference between those sorts of revolutions I'm talking about and something like the War of the Roses.
Right. Okay.
Okay. The War of the Roses was still, at the end of the day, a bunch of lords fighting over who gets the crown, but they were still aristocrats. You understand what I'm saying? So, yeah.
But and I guess then just moving on to the cultural dimension of this, which of course interests me, particularly the rise of woke. Let's just say, how does that fit into the story of the circulation of elites? Because on the one hand, it is true we have had a long period of very great sensitivity around race, gender, and sexuality, particularly race and gender. But it's intensified in the 2010s to the point that, and as you saw, even in academia area, but making a big difference. So I'm just kind of wondering, how does cultural shifting, say, towards nationalism, towards cosmopolitanism, towards wokeism, away from wokeism, where do you think that comes from, and where do you see it going, I guess?
Okay, well, there's two separate things to say on this. The first, we didn't get into the Burnham part, the managerialism. It's probably worth explaining that what Burnham actually did is that he applied those principles of elite theory that I talked about to the market and to stock ownership, shareholders. And he said that the same principles that apply, the organized minority as against the disorganized mass, also apply when you have mass shareholders and account managers. So, I mean, we were talking about entrenched elites. Larry Fink is a decent example, okay? Larry Fink has a lot of assets under his nominal control. BlackRock have a lot of assets. Even my pension, I discovered the other day, okay? Right?
Are you ESG compliant now?
And this, I guess, is what Burnham was getting at, though, which is that a lot of the investors in such a structure, a lot of the owners don't have functional control over what is done because of there's a severance between ownership and control. And this is when Burnham was talking about managerialism, this was as against the old kind of tycoon. Pretty good example is Henry Ford, the actual, everybody knows who Henry Ford was. You know, he was essentially a little dictator of his own company. Famously, he wouldn't hire any accountants. So he really did have, I mean, he just wouldn't hire accountants. It was one of his things. But he set up the Ford Foundation, and over time, the Ford Motor Company and the Ford Foundation became what you might call managerial, i.e., yes, the Ford family still exists. Yes, they own a lot of assets, but the actual decisions, what is done with that money, how it's allocated, then comes under managerial control. And to come back to your question on culture, the Ford Foundation's a pretty good example of it. What is that money being used for? It's being used to advance all sorts of social liberal projects, especially LGBT and many other right-on causes through history. And Burnham argues is that the managerial class as a class are kind of uniquely mobile. They're kind of like I remember back, was it David Goodhart, the Anywheres and Somewheres?
Yes, yeah, Anywhere,
right?
yeah.
And he said that essentially a manager can kind of move. I mean, a good example would be, do you remember when Nick Clegg went from being the leader of the Lib Dems to working for Facebook?
Right. Yeah.
Right. So it's like kind of like they're recognizably a class who move from, or even more extraordinary, when Mark Carney went from being the Bank of England head to the leader of
Prime Minister of Canada. Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
You know, so I mean, quite literally moving. Or Rishi Sunak went from being the Prime Minister. What is he working for? Microsoft now? Or
yeah, I've lost track. But
so everybody understands that this is a class of people, and that class of people, they can be in New York, they can be in London, Chicago, Tokyo. It doesn't really matter. And so the sets of values, the sets of it kind of lends itself towards some of the sorts of things that have become woke over time. Another thing is that a kind of bureaucratic function has a habit of getting beyond its original remit. It wants to enlarge its own budget. It wants to, and if you're tasked with, I don't know, let's say your target is reducing the amount of racism or something, or awareness of racism. Awareness of racism is probably a better one. You have a permanent incentive to say, well, there's a lot of racism. Or, I mean, I remember, I was in this meeting before. They were like, the number of students who experience anxiety now is 78%, and therefore we need to enlarge the budget of the welfare centre. I remember I was in that meeting and I said, hold on a second, that means that the welfare centre has failed in its task. We want to enlarge its budget, but that's obviously not.
How'd that go down?
That's obviously not the point of the stat. The point of the stat is more staff, more power. To grow that function. Yeah. So you can see how the bureaucracy and managerialism can take on a life of its own, which has nothing to do with selling motor cars or teaching undergraduate courses or anything else. Yeah.
Yeah, and you can even see that with these arm's length bodies like the CPS for criminals here, but or not for criminals, for the police. There is also, I think it's what's interesting. I mean, you have this culture, this kind of progressive culture that seems to spread amongst the managerial class. But I think that probably only appeared at a certain moment in the 20th century. So it seems as though modern culture, this is a group that's attracted to what's most modern. And I think there was in your book also, I think it was Pareto or one of them who talked about this group that always likes change and novelty, being overrepresented in this kind of mandarinate. But of course, at other times, we've had a more nationalistic, think of the Young Turks and other kind of bureaucrats that are actually either conservative or very nationalistic. So it's this, I think maybe the cultural stuff has a somewhat separate pattern, but it intersects at certain times with this managerialism. Right now, clearly these two things are going together very strongly. And so the managerialism is pushing woke culture very strongly, but whereas maybe at another age, another period, it might have been different.
I mean, people disagree with me on this, but I happen to think that our rulers at the moment, our ruling class, if you want to put it that way, are less. They're more willing to be pragmatic than it sometimes appears, and willing to wear different masks, have different justifications for what they're doing at different times. I mean, to me, it's clear that woke was there was a very strong push for woke,
right,
and a very strong backlash to it.
Yeah.
And I mean, in the exact same way that Mark Zuckerberg went from funding the Democrats to wearing a red hat, I don't put it past some of them, not all of them, of course. There will be true believers in every, but I wouldn't put it past some of them to be like, okay, well, we have to pay lip service to patriotism, or, I mean, recently there was this whole flag waving business. Every political party at their conference waved the flag as if they were all patriots all of a sudden.
Right.
So there's there's an extent to which there's some flexibility, I think, to, put on. I mean, I remember living through the period of the Iraq War, and that was a different paradigm. There was a different set of enemies and so on at that time. And, at some point that changed. At some point it's like, well,
yeah,
we went from that paradigm to then woke for some,
right.
That one, I mean, that one kind of worked reasonably well. There was still a big backlash against that. If you remember, 1 million people marched in London, but we very distinctly went from that paradigm to this woke thing. So I wouldn't. The point I'm making is that there's an extent to which the structure is able to kind of say enough to contain some of these energies. And I know there's one. I mean, I'm not sure how much I agree with the idea, but there's one idea that goes around on the left that woke was actually a kind of attempt to crowd out, I guess you'd put it, the energy around the
1%, the Occupy
Wall Street and all of that sort of stuff, because now, like, think about what they achieved. In the space of 10 years, they got people from, going at the banks and the 1% and all of that to cheering on Disney because they put on trans cartoons or something. Right. You know what I mean? It's kind of remarkable that they're able to do that. But in another sense, I think it's been terribly backfired. I think it's when we look back in 50 years' time, it will be seen as one of the greatest aberrations.
Right. Interesting. Because I think there's obviously different ways to look at this, and you're looking at it in a more instrumental way, in a more elite top-down way, and I would tend to think that there's more true belief in bottom-up. Mm-hmm. And so I would look at things like the resistance in the Democratic Party. Electorally, it is terrible for them, and yet they can't let go of the trans agenda. They can't let go of so much of the woke agenda, for example, or even in universities, they will shapeshift, they will defend, they will, they really are, it's really anathema. But I would say that what's interesting is you see the kind of upper layers like the presidents and the trustees. Now, the trustees might be politically appointed, but the presidents are only too happy to junk this stuff or to see it go. But the academics and the administrators seem to be really invested in this, and they really don't want to let it go. So I don't know. I mean, we'll see. I hope you're right. In a way, it's quite an optimistic picture you're painting, is that, well, it's no longer in their interest. Perhaps they can let it go. I'm a little more pessimistic. I think that people have spiritually bought into this so strongly that I don't think they will.
It's possible that they have bought into it, but the question is, do those people, those true believers, are they what I would call the clients of power? Okay, or do they have power in and of themselves? Because if they were simply newly elected bureaucrats can serve a purpose for a time, and then they can be done away with. The example I always look at, I know it's Henry VIII. Henry VIII used various different newly elected bureaucrats to serve different things, to smash the church, for example, or get him a divorce or whatever else it was. And then when they start becoming problematic and become, as I call them, a rival castle, a rival to his power, he did away with them. And in a sense, I think that this is this has started to happen with woke. And this is what I always said, is that people used to talk about woke as a religion. And I'll be like, well, we'll know if woke is a real religion or not. Because once all the incentives are removed, once you actually have to suffer, every religion has had this, Protestant martyrs, or Catholics burned to the stake or something. If we're getting to the point where people are willing to die for woke, then you'll know it's truly a religion. But my suspicion is that as the incentives are removed, as it's made clear that, it's not going to get you a promotion, or it's not going to get you invited to the right parties or whatnot, we'll see how many true believers are left. So,
and I really hope you're right. I guess I see it's anywhere outside the U.S. It's got the same iron grip it's always had. In the U.S., definitely the incentives, at least for certain elements, have been removed by the current administration. And I think it will be interesting, very interesting to see.
There's always a lag from the imperial center to the vassals, which is where we...
Yeah, well, you're right. And then, so I guess I think we should talk a little bit too about, moving on from woke, about I should say we've got a special issue in Theory and Society from the Heterodox Social Science Conference, which we held last year. Just looking at really countercultural positions in, academic work in the social sciences, because the argument there is that social science research has been skiing on the same piste and staying within the red lines that progressives have set out. And so what we want to do is get ski off piste. And so part of that conference was about doing that. Do you want to tell us a little bit about your contribution to the special issue, what you're arguing?
So, one of the things I've been interested in is value-free analysis. That is, an attempt to have an objective point of view, as much as we can manage. Obviously, there's always some subjective, but we're trying to get beyond our own prejudices and biases and emotions to see what is, as Machiavelli would say, to write as, what is, not what ought to be. And this is what the elite theorists did. And also in economics, that's what economics is meant to be. Whether it ever achieves that, I don't know. But some notion, I guess, back to Max Weber, of the value-free science.
Right.
Okay?
Science as a vocation. That essay.
Right. And I feel like people, not just woke people, but just across the West in general, not just in academia, but in most major policy decision-making areas, have lost the ability to do that seriously. for a variety of different reasons. So I wanted to, in that paper, to talk not just about woke, but about woke-like modes of thinking. So I was trying to define what that means. It's something beyond simply groupthink or an orthodoxy. It's a bit more aggressive. It's a bit more zealous. You know, I think people forget how nasty woke was at its height. You know, you're not just wrong. You're actually a bad person. You're evil for thinking this way, and therefore you need to actually be removed from the organization. You need to be made a pariah.
Re-educated.
You need to be re-educated. You're a heretic, essentially. So this is, it's this. But if you notice, it doesn't just go on there. It went on, it goes on basically like, I mean, let's give some examples. COVID, the Ukraine war. I mean, both of those issues had an extraordinary amount of censorship around them. People were not permitted to speak freely about them. People were cancelled. People were, you know, deplatformed and debanked in some extreme cases. And there was a very quick, no, this is the official line. You must trust the expert. And if you dissent against that, very bad things will happen to you. And also, you're a bad person. And that was extremely strong on both of those issues. And I mean, especially on the Ukraine war, the contrast between that and the conversation that happened on the Iraq war back in 2002, 2003, which I remember, you know, none of the TV stations have staged any of those debates. You know, you haven't got Harold Pinter with his Nobel Prize talking about, like, that has just not, that conversation has not really been allowed to happen. It's happened in some alternative spaces and so on. And again, I'm not taking a side on the issue. I'm just saying it's very notable that the conversation is not even allowed to take place. And then the stories you hear internally in the institutions is that, no, this is the line. If you're against the line, you're out. And the basic idea in this article that is coming out is that that's a problem. If you have a systematic, I mean, remember that film a few years back called The Death of Stalin?
Yes, yeah.
I mean, it's kind of like, well, if you're always just following whatever the line is, it means nobody's thinking, it means nobody's asking questions, and most importantly, it means nobody's telling the truth about the situation. And I mean, one of the absurdities is that football clubs don't run like this. Every football club has got analytics, and they've got like data and stats, and you know it's really important to get the assessment of the opposing team correct. What are their tactics? But if a football club was run in the same way that we run our countries, or foreign policy, or our domestic policy, none of that stuff would be allowed to happen. How dare you say Cristiano Ronaldo is a great player? You know, that side is evil. So it's not like it. So it strikes me that football clubs are run in a more adult manner than many of our institutions at the moment, and that is a problem.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Although it's interesting with Moneyball, you could see where there was still a battle that had to be fought to use statistics as opposed to gut feel. But anyway, that's another. Just as we're getting towards the end, there is a question, though, I suppose, in the sense that can the establishment, the elite, I mean, I'm going to try and sort of, for a minute, sort of steel man the other position. Can the establishment and the elite sometimes get it right? So I guess recently there's been, for example, on X, you've seen Nick Fuentes now saying, look, Candace Owens and some of these people are just conspiracy nuts, and they're saying Charlie Kirk wasn't murdered and all this sort of stuff. So is there at some point some merit in not ostracizing, but at least lampooning, which is a sort of soft form of ostracism, people whose theories are not backed up with any evidence or don't seem to be verifiable? I mean, is there some role perhaps for some kind of gatekeeping? And what's your view on that?
I mean, well, my view is that these things are inevitable. Like, I am not one of these kind of free speech absolutists, because I look at history and be like, well, there's never been free speech. The actual history of this country is just 1,000 years of censorship, basically.
Right.
But so that would be the first thing I'd say. But I think the problem is that if the institutions are not credible, if the institutions seem like they're lying, if the institutions carry on in the way that we've been talking about, they lose credibility themselves, and therefore there's no real comeback to the mad conspiracies that you see online. So you do, and I mean, it's kind of an interesting real life experiment. It's an interesting real life experiment, because I think Candice Owens is like the number one. She's like the number one or number
huge
two.
audience,
It's an absolutely massive audience. So,
But there seems to be a marker for that. I remember when I was growing up, the National Enquirer, and it was Elvis was alive, and the two, the Martian and the two-headed baby. And there seems to be the kind of a certain market for the crazier the better. But anyway, we'll I'll just say, this could be a very unpopular sentiment, but I feel like people need guidance, and actually do want leadership. In a serious way, just not the sort we've been having over the past decade or so, like a different type of leadership, I guess. Okay, well, very last question is really just in terms of the mission of heterodox social science, in terms of your own work. What do you see as the next steps? Where are you going? Where do you think we, as a movement of call it alternative or countercultural social science, needs to go? Any thoughts?
Ideally, I'd like to see a greater willingness of people who've been closed to ideas to actually open up and start having dialogue again, start thinking seriously about things, rather than cloistering in these. It's a cliche to say echo chambers, but it really has become a self-perpetuating loop where you can kind of tell these people are just talking to themselves, and they're not able to see what's going on. Because in an ideal, to come back to elite theory, in an ideal scenario, there shouldn't be a division between what we call the elites and the people. There should be a moral unity. They shouldn't actually be at odds. They should generally be kind of on the same page. And I think one of the real problems we've got at the moment is that is not happening, which is why, electorally, we're seeing projections of both the main parties being wiped out for the first time in a very long time. And I suggest the reason that's happening is because all of these people who are in positions of authority have just stopped listening. They've
It is, and it's interesting as you mentioned that, because we're going to have Stephen Webb in next, and one of the reports he recently wrote was a co-author on, showed some polling from More in Common, the share of, they would go into these public bodies and do these surveys on their, they have the hidden tribes of attitude segments, and the progressive activists, who are 8 to 10% of the UK, were coming out in 60, 70, 80% of these public bodies and comms teams, and it was just staggering overrepresentation of people whose views are really, really a fringe within the society. So this is I think it is a real crisis moment of legitimacy for these institutions. Neema Parvini, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks a lot.
All right.